The Republican Party has long been the party of choice for America's evangelicals. But since the emergence of Donald Trump, the blending of religion and politics has reached new heights. A new piece in The Atlantic, headlined, "Lord, Help Us Make America Great Again," takes a deep dive into the prayers given at the beginning of Trump rallies and analyzes why America's religious right is firmly behind Donald Trump. Joining us now, the author of that piece, staff writer at The Atlantic, McKay Coppins. McKay, you've covered this so extensively throughout your career, and you write in this new piece, Trump supporters attribute America's fall from grace to a variety of national sins, old and new. Prayer bans in public schools, illegal immigration, pro-transgender policies, the purported rigging of a certain recent election. Whatever the specifics, the picture of America they paint is almost universally biblically bleak. The premise of all of these prayers is that America's covenant can be reestablished and its special place in God's kingdom restored if the nation repents and turns back to Him. Ryan Burge, a Baptist minister and political scientist, told me that these ideas have long percolated on the religious right. What's new is how many Christians now seem convinced that God has anointed a specific leader who, like those prophets of old, is prepared to defeat the forces of evil and redeem the country. And that leader is running for president. So, McKay, that's an excerpt from your piece. It remains the unlikeliest of marriages, the evangelicals and Donald Trump. Those bonds, though, seem to have only grown stronger. Tell us where we are in the middle of 2024.
Yeah, like you said, I have been covering the Trump campaign for a long time. I've attended more than 100 Trump rallies over the course of my career. And the premise of this piece was that the prayers that are given at the beginning of these campaign events don't often get that much journalistic attention. We tend to focus on what Trump himself is saying, but they provide a really interesting and I think revealing insight into the religious right's attitude toward Trump. One of the evolutions that you see in these prayers, and we ended up compiling 58 of them since Trump launched his most recent campaign, and the idea was to kind of examine the theological motifs. One of the things you really see is that in 2016, the way that you heard conservative evangelicals talk about Trump was that he was like Cyrus the Great, who was a 6th century BC Persian king who liberated the Israelites from Babylonian captivity. And the idea was, look, he's an unlikely vessel. He's not a believer himself, but he's going to help us do God's will. You don't really see that language in these prayers anymore. What you see is him being compared to righteous prophetic heroes, that he is not only somebody who is kind of a tool in God's hand, but that he is godly and righteous himself. And in fact, in many of these prayers, the stakes of the election are really ratcheted up to the point where Trump is considered, the representative of the forces of good, and Joe Biden, Kamala Harris are the forces of evil. And so you really see the way that the election is being framed in these prayers as an example of how the stakes of the election have come to feel so kind of biblically, apocalyptically high for so many Americans.
McKay, what has really caught my eye about your article is exactly what you just talked about, because we saw 25 years ago the moral majority and how many of the right-wing candidates would be shaped by the moral majority and adjust themselves to that. Then you saw Trump earlier, that this was a sinner, but that God was going to use. How do we get from there to now where he is the incarnation of what God wants right now? It's like the whole Christian right has almost abandoned what they are standing for to make it fit Trump rather than make Trump fit them.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
It's such an important distinction because, I will say I came into this piece as a person of faith. I say prayers every day. I pray for our government leaders. I think it's totally appropriate to pray for political leaders of both parties. But the distinction you just made is important. praying that our political leaders will be guided by God, that they will have character and make wise and righteous decisions, is different from the premise that a lot of these prayers start from, which is that Trump is already righteous. I shared these prayers with a handful of scholars and theologians, and one of them said to me, you know, nobody in these prayers seems to pray that that Trump will do right by God. Everybody prays that God will do right by Trump. And I think that the evolution that's happened is that a lot of these people who are Donald Trump's most devout religious supporters are, you know, living not only inside of their faith, they're not only going to church, they're living inside this kind of right-wing media ecosystem in which Donald Trump is constantly being presented as an infallible hero, right? And if you believe that, if you believe that Trump is righteous, that everything he does is de facto good, it's impossible to see anything that happens in this campaign that goes the wrong way as anything other than the work of the devil.
McKay, I have been to a lot of, not 100, but a lot of Trump rallies, and I'm glad you did this because I've had the same sort of reaction about the prayers at the beginning are apocalyptic. And, you know, you quote one in particular that happened in North Charleston, South Carolina. We're fighting the real enemy that comes from the gates of hell, led by one of its leaders called Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So saying that the other ticket is coming from the gates of hell and that it is this holy war. And just to paint the picture, everyone, you hear that followed probably by the Jan 6 choir, right? Singing the national anthem. And then the former president of the United States talking about pardoning Jan 6 prisoners. What is, if you imagine, a loss for this ticket, you know, what are these rallies and the religious and the prayers, what it's sort of sowing in this crowd of Trump supporters?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern you're getting at is the one that was rattling around in my mind as I studied these prayers, which is that, of course, if you believe that this election is a battle between good and evil and that God is on your side, if your side loses, you have to believe that something is amiss, right? It plants the seeds of conspiracy theory. It plants the seeds of election denialism. Certainly I was thinking about that as I was reviewing these prayers, but I'll say that I'm almost just as concerned as what happens if Trump wins. I quote toward the end of the piece from a prayer that was given in Iowa, where the pastor who is praying promises righteous retribution for if Donald Trump is reelected against those who would seek to do evil. And again, I think that both sides can be guilty of ratcheting up the stakes of any given election to be too high. But this is an example of where if you believe that, again, God is on your side, it becomes very risky that you believe that a win is not only an electoral mandate, but a divine mandate to do whatever you want. And so I do think that we need to think about that and keep that in the back of our minds as we're looking at some of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump campaign.
Yeah, it's really important reporting, and it's online now for The Atlantic. Staff writer McKay Coppins. McKay, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.